Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I want to talk a little bit about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, and that is fantasy literature. I have read a lot of fantasy literature in my time. I began, as a lot of people did, with the C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia and The Hobbit, graduating to Lord of the Rings as I got a little bit older. All very good stories, very interesting to read, and I have since moved on to a number of other more mainstream fantasy properties. One that I didn't actually engage a whole lot with was Harry Potter. I read the first book in that, and I thought it was passable. I mean, it's very inventive. It had some great imagery in it. But all in all, I didn't really get sucked into the world or the story or the characters like a lot of other people did. So I took a pass on that one. But as I have worked on a fantasy story of my own, the first one that I've actually written in quite some time, and the first one that I intend to share with the public, I've been thinking a little bit about the various parts of fantasy and how they speak to me and what I'm trying to do with them. So, if you want to come along with me for a little bit, we'll break down this genre and what I want to do with it. Not so much necessarily what every writer is trying to do with it, but the things that have really stood out to me as the most meaningful and the most impactful. And the first one, and the one most people probably talk about, is the world building. Fantasy nerds love fantasy worlds. It's a truism like water is wet or the winter is cold. We really geek out over the history, the languages, the finishing touches, the cultures, the strange creatures, the magical powers. All of these things really, really fascinate people. And I like to build worlds. I like to build out history. I like to think about the environments that shape people. I like to think about the kind of tools they use, the kind of clothes they wear. That doesn't really make me unusual in the fantasy nerd scene, as I've said before. I just mentioned these things to point out that, yes, I am a lot like a lot of the other mainstream fantasy fans. The second thing that tends to appeal to a lot of fantasy people is magic. Most fantasy stories have some kind of supernatural or superpower system that makes them interesting, and these systems have depths and quirks and functions to them to support the story. Now, you might say this is part of world building, and that's a fair argument. I section it off by itself because lots of people will just build a magic system and then somewhat paste it over what is essentially the real world and tell their story that way. In some ways, Harry Potter is just that. Of course, in many ways, it is its own unique, distinct world with its own geography, with its own places, with its own history. But magic, in particular, fulfills a different kind of fantasy than just living in a world that has no historical ties to our own, that has no social ties to our own, that has creatures that are not like those in our own. Whereas a fantasy world, the geography, the history, the residents offer the possibility of seeing things that have never been seen before, of going new places for the first time. Magic offers a power fantasy. And you hear this term used a lot, and not just to apply to traditional fantasy. A power fantasy is the ability to take control of your life or of your circumstances in ways that you normally could not. And magic is just that to a T. Whether it gives you the ability to fly, whether it gives you the ability to see into the future, whether it gives you the ability to make fire with a snap of your fingers. You are getting a kind of agency that you did not have before. And that is a big part of fantasy for people. Not only does the typical fantasy nerd want to go places and see things that do not exist on Earth, they want to be able to interact with and affect them in ways they could not on Earth. And a magic system, whether it's as seemingly simple as alchemy in Full Metal Alchemist, or as deep and as complicated as the weird spells and alchemy in something like Harry Potter, the goal is to provide the reader with a sense that there is a way to interact with this world that is special and unique and different. The third aspect that people like about fantasy is that there is some kind of meaning which is not easily apparent in the real world. Whether that be through prophecies, whether it be through divine revelations, whether it be through some kind of magical understanding of the way the world works, fantasy stories can provide us with an understanding of the world and its structures and its purposes that we have to basically take on faith in the real world. And while it is very important to grapple with the concepts of faith and how we understand the world and what we take on faith and what we take on our own experiences and what is taught to us and all these other things, fantasy can kind of set aside some of those questions to deal with other questions. Like, how would we play out a principle once we know it for sure? Once a principle is clearly in place, how does it interact with other principles that may be just as clear-cut? Or how does it interact with things like political structures or economies or social structures? Fantasy can play around with all of these questions and make them a little bit simpler and easier to comprehend by taking this element of uncertainty out of play. A lot of storytelling does this. Fantasy is uniquely suited to it because it says, hey, there are things about this world that are totally different from our own. We can rely on them in this world even if we aren't 100% sure of them in our own world, just like this world has dragons even though our own world does not. These three things together make for a very potent kind of storytelling because they can put a person in a world where they can engage with questions about the human experience and examine them through a lens of experiences and capabilities that are a bit removed from their own and with a greater degree of certainty than normal, and try and come to grips with those questions, with those issues, with those difficulties. That makes fantasy very useful. Now, that usefulness can certainly overextend itself and become almost a hostile meme that takes over every aspect of your life. Again, let's take Harry Potter as an example of this. But even if that is a danger, that is not a danger that lies on the creator, but rather on the consumer. So as you are crafting a story to try and deal with some of these ideas and issues, definitely consider fantasy as a part of the way you go about them. And I have done that in my own work from time to time. And I've come back to that because there are questions about duties and responsibilities and liberties that have been bugging me for a while. And I've started to write stories to try and work out these questions through the lens of a fantastical world. And that story is called Burning Bright. I'm going to be talking about it a little bit more on this channel, as well as over on my writing vlog channel, Horizon Talker, which I've already been talking about it for a while, but mostly about the process of writing it. In the meantime, this basic primer to the three aspects of fantasy that I find the most engaging and the most important are the starting point for understanding that story and the thought processes that led me to tell it. That's what I've got for you today, but definitely stay tuned here because I'm going to keep talking about this as time goes on. So if you want to follow this, there is a like and a subscribe button down below. You can use both of those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.